As a part of this webinar series, today we have Mr. Anirudh Krishnan joining us with this insight on judicial intervention and its impact. The founder of AK Law Chamber, Mr. Anirudh Krishnan, graduated from Nalsar, Hyderabad and completed the BSL course from Oxford University and specializes in arbitration and commercial dispute resolution. He's a legal practitioner and an arbitrator who is also a consultant to the expert panel constituted by the Law Commission of India to deliberate on proposed reforms to arbitration law in India. Mr. Anirudh is also author of numerous international and domestic publications and has published many articles on the subject. We welcome you, sir. Your reputation precedes you, and we can't wait to hear you on the topic.
Thank you so much. Thank you for the kind introduction. And I would first like to thank Justice Padmanabhan and Dr. Paul Chellakumar for inviting me to be present before you and to give me such an interesting topic to deal with today. I hope my PowerPoint is visible.
Now it's not visible, sir. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, is it fine now? Is it clear now?
Yes, sir.
Yes.
So my topic for today's discussion is going to be judicial intervention in arbitrations. This is a extremely wide topic because I think it looks at judicial intervention at various levels. But I will try and while my presentation goes into every aspect, I will try and limit the in-depth discussion into 6 broad topics. Right? Before I get into these topics, let me set out a few policy considerations that would govern to what extent there must be judicial intervention. On one hand, you look at arbitration as a dispute resolution mechanism that is alternative to the regular court system and driven by party autonomy. So you want party autonomy to really be prevalent and you want minimum judicial intervention as a result of the same. On one hand, you have this consideration of party autonomy. The other extreme, another way of looking at arbitration is a method of outsourcing justice delivery. Therefore, you want to ensure that the outcome of an arbitration, in fact, namely an arbitral award, is in fact in consonance with principles of Indian law. This would necessarily mean some level of review by courts. Various countries have grappled with dealing with these 2 rival policy considerations, and most litigations have arisen as a result of the same. During the course of my presentation, you will notice that at various stages, this conflict becomes evident. I wanted to set out the policy considerations before I actually get into the topic. Now, when you look at judicial intervention, you can look at judicial intervention at 3 stages: the pre-arbitration stage, during the arbitration, and thirdly, post-arbitration. So when you look at pre-arbitration, you're looking at judicial intervention under sections 8, 9, and 11 primarily, and in some situations 14 as well. 14 would be during arbitration. Then you have during arbitration where you're looking at 14 and 27 and sometimes 9. Post-arbitration, you're looking at 9, 34, 36, 37, 48, etc. Now, let me, there will be some topics that would cut across various kinds of judicial intervention at various stages. For instance, the test on arbitrability is a test that would cut across judicial intervention at various stages. So today, while I will be dealing with this stage-wise, I will be focusing on 6 very crucial topics. The rest of it, I will skim through, because otherwise this topic is something where you can speak about it for days. So I will be focusing on arbitrability. I will be focusing on the scope of section 9 and the scope of section 17 for interim relief. I will also be dealing with the scope of section 11 prior to the amendments and post amendments. Thereafter, the fourth topic that I would be dealing with is interference during the arbitration, that is section 27. Thereafter, post award, I will be focusing for a fair amount of time on the scope of challenge of an award, because starting from the decision in Renu Sagar till the recent decision in Sanyong and subsequent cases of Vijay Karya, this has really evolved, and this is one of the most crucial aspects of arbitration law. And lastly, I will be touching upon judicial interference in foreign seated arbitrations, where I'll be running through the line of judgments from Bhatia to Balco till the amendments. Right? Other aspects will be set out in my PowerPoint, but I'm going to be skimming through it. Okay. Now, let me start off with judicial interference prior to the arbitration. First head under this would be Section 8 of the Arbitration and Conciliation Act. When you look at Section 8, you are primarily looking at a scenario where a party goes and files a civil suit, ignoring an arbitration clause. The other side's remedy is to file an application under Section 8 seeking reference before the arbitral tribunal. When you look at the scope of Section 8, let us focus on the language of Section 8(1). A judicial authority before which an action is brought in a matter which is the subject of an arbitration agreement. Please note the word subject of an arbitration agreement. Shall, if a party so applies not later than when submitting his first statement on the substance of the dispute, refer the parties to arbitration. This was the wording prior to the amendment. Right? Now, the reason I'm saying prior to the amendment is there's one very crucial change that has thereafter been brought in, is the word parties has been replaced by parties or a party claiming through or under a party. Now, when you look at the various facets of the test under Section 8(1), you firstly have the reference to judicial authority. The rationale behind saying any judicial authority is to make it wider than just a court. So you may have a situation where a petition is filed before the National Company Law Tribunal, where it is purportedly a dispute for relating to operation and mismanagement. But when you look at the nature of the dispute, in fact, it is not one for operation and mismanagement, but a pure contractual dispute which would be covered by the arbitration clause. In such a scenario, the tribunal would also come within the ambit of judicial authority. Of course, you have the test of arbitrability that has to be gone into in this regard, which I will be dealing with next. So the purport of saying judicial authority is to make it wide enough rather than make it a very narrow test. The second facet is matter which is the subject of an arbitration. Now, when you look at the wording in Section 8, and you will notice similar wording in 34(2)(b), the word used is subject of an arbitration or subject matter of an arbitration. For a matter to be a subject of an arbitration, it should be a matter which is capable of being the subject of an arbitration, which means that in essence, it must be an arbitrable dispute. Now, what is an arbitrable dispute? Because for you to refer a matter to arbitration, firstly, there has to be an arbitration agreement, and secondly, there has to be an arbitrable dispute. Now, broadly speaking, there are two main heads and one ad hoc category. The Supreme Court in Booz Allen's case has gone into the issue as to what kinds of disputes are arbitrable and what are not. The Supreme Court has held that a dispute arising out of a right in rem would usually not be arbitrable, and a dispute arising out of a right in personam would usually be arbitrable. One exception that is carved out is if the dispute relates to a right in personam arising out of a right in rem, then the same would be arbitrable. Now, what do you mean by a right in rem? A right in rem is a right that one possesses against the rest of the world. A right in personam is a right inter se between parties. So let me give you an example. If I claim title to a patent, if I say that I have a patent over this particular product, I have if the dispute, so I claim that another party is infringing my patent. If the other party comes and says, no, you don't even have title to the patent, your title itself is faulty, this is not patentable in the first place, right? Then in such a scenario, what is in question is your right, not just against the other party, because if ultimately there's a finding that you do not own a patent, that would be something that would affect the rest of the world. The rest of the world can use that product without having a license agreement with you. Therefore, what is in question here is a right in rem, because it's your right against the rest of the world. Therefore, the title to a patent cannot be the subject matter of an arbitration. But if the other party is not disputing your patent, but they say, you entered into a license agreement with me, and pursuant to the license agreement, I'm authorized to use it, then the dispute is a right in personam arising out of the right in rem, because the right in personam is created by the license agreement. This may arise from the main right in rem, namely your title to the patent itself. But what is in dispute is your right in personam arising out of the right in rem, and that would be arbitrable. Right? So the first category is right in rem versus right in personam. The second category is based on statutory remedies. So if a remedy is provided in by the statute, and the statute contemplates that a specialized body or a specialized judicial authority must exercise these powers, then your only remedy is before those statutory authorities and not an arbitral tribunal. Again, the authority for this is Booz Allen. I have in the next slide all the authorities on the subject, which I will project, but I'm giving you the concept first. So therefore, if you're filing a mortgage suit, your remedy is under Order 34 of the CPC before a civil court. If you are filing for winding up under the old Companies Act 1956, the Companies Act 1956, and that's the ratio of Haryana Telecom versus Sterlite Industries. The remedy provided therein is a statutory remedy which only the company court can exercise. Therefore, you can't file a Section 8 application saying that the matter must be referred to arbitration, because the dispute is not an arbitrable dispute. Right? Therefore, the first category is right in rem. Second category is statutory remedy. You will. The third is a more ad hoc category, which is developed based on public policy. So, for instance, disputes involving a virtual case of criminal law, where there's criminality involved. Then you have questions relating to allegations of fraud, for which there's the latest judgment of Rashid Raza. Then you have consumer disputes. Then you have trust disputes. Insofar as tenancy disputes, you have two conflicting Supreme Court judgments. On one hand, you have Himangini, where the Supreme Court said that any dispute arising out of a lease agreement is not arbitrable. Because the argument there was that this is that only if the dispute relates to a special statute, that is, if there's a local rent control act which says that for eviction you must go before a special court, then there would be a exclusion. But in Himangini, the Supreme Court took it one step further. Despite holding that the Delhi Rent Control Act would not be applicable on the facts of the case, they held that the dispute is not arbitrable. But the correctness of Himangini has been has been doubted by the Supreme Court, and it has now been referred to a larger bench, where before in Vidya Drolia and given to understand a 3-judge bench of the Supreme Court has considered it and reserved it for orders. Right? Therefore, today when you're looking at arbitrability, you are looking at rights in rem. Generally, as the entire class, if it's a right in rem, it's not arbitrable. Statutory remedy, if it's a statutory remedy, it's not arbitrable. And the third are ad hoc categories that have evolved. I'm not listed out everything exhaustively. For you to get an exhaustive list, please go and you may refer to the judgment in Booz Allen, where all the categories are set out. In addition to that, you may add to that consumer disputes and trust disputes, because these have evolved through subsequent case law. All right. Now, this is the basic case on arbitrability. See, there are aspects in this that I can go into, which are topics for discussion for 45 minutes themselves, like arbitrability of fraud, because the test has been varied at different points of time, starting from the judgment in Madhav Prabhakar's case in 1962, where the Supreme Court said that where an allegation of fraud, let me briefly deal with allegation of fraud because it comes up quite often and there are a lot of judgments. Right? In Madhav Prabhakar's case in 1962, the Supreme Court took the view that where an allegation of fraud is made against a party, it is open to that party to decide whether it wants to defend itself in a private forum or a public forum. Right? Therefore, the test there was that if the allegation is made against a party, that party can choose whether it wants to go for arbitration or defend itself in the public forum. This itself is based on an 1880 judgment in England called Russell versus Russell, which has since been overruled in England. Right? Quoting Madhav Prabhakar, the Supreme Court in Radhakrishnan versus Maestro Engineering widened the test to say disputes of fraud are not arbitrable. The Supreme Court also relied upon a Madras High Court judgment in Omar Said's case, which referred to the powers that a civil court would have under the CPC to say that it's a competence issue. It's an issue of competence because the tribunal does not have all the powers of a civil court. Subsequently, Radhakrishnan versus Maestro Engineers was doubted and held to be per incurium by a single judge of the Supreme Court. Radhakrishnan was a division bench. A single judge, while hearing a Section 11 application in Swiss timing, held that Radhakrishnan is bad law. Subsequently, everything came to be considered in Ayyaswamy's case, which was the same bench strength as Radhakrishnan. Ayyaswamy's case held that Swiss timing is wrong, that in fact Radhakrishnan would be the test, but narrowed down the Radhakrishnan test to say serious questions of fraud can be arbitrated upon, not so serious questions of fraud cannot be arbitrated upon, not so serious questions of fraud can be arbitrated upon. Now, this was again a very vague test, because what is a serious question and what is not a serious question? In that, there is a 6-point test that is set out by Justice Sikri in paragraph 26 of Ayyaswamy. Now, this was further considered in this judgment, Rashid Raza's case that we've referred here. Right? In Rashid Raza, this Ayyaswamy was considered. In Rashid Raza's case, this paragraph 26 of Ayyaswamy was quoted. A 3-judge bench of the Supreme Court holds that Ayyaswamy paragraph 26 is the law of the land. But then while summarizing Ayyaswamy, the Supreme Court narrows down the test, and today there is a 2-step test. Does the fraud permeate to the arbitration agreement? And 2, does it have public policy consequences? That is, does it have consequences beyond the two parties? Now, it's possible to get into all of this and say that Rashid Raza did not intend to narrow down Ayyaswamy and that Ayyaswamy is the law. But when you look at that summary in Rashid Raza, all of you may read, it's a 5-paragraph judgment. The 4th paragraph of Rashid Raza sets out the law in a very narrow test. It's one thing to say that Rashid Raza has not overruled Ayyaswamy, but Rashid Raza's test is perhaps the correct test to be followed, because world over, questions of fraud are arbitrated upon. And Rashid Raza helps us move in that direction. All right. So, insofar as arbitrability is concerned, these are broadly the controversies that have arisen. Now, let me move on to the next aspect of Section 8, which is also equally relevant from a Section 45 point of view. Now, I had earlier read out the wording of Section 8.1. Now, let me, the 8.1 stood amended by virtue of the 2015 amendments. The words party in Section 8.1 was replaced by the same language as you will find in Section 45. Let me point out this language to you. This is Section 45. Please keep in mind Section 8 relates to domestic arbitrations. Section 45 is the equivalent provision for a foreign seated arbitration. Therefore, if there is an arbitration in London between two parties and one party ignoring the arbitration clause files a civil suit in India, then the remedy of the defendant to the suit is to file an application under Section 45 to say that I am covered by the arbitration clause. Please refer me to arbitration in London. If the clause was a domestic arbitration clause, the same application would be under Section 8. Prior to the amendment, there was one very crucial difference between the two, namely the language here. Okay, notwithstanding anything contained in Part 1 or in the CPC, a judicial authority, when seized of an action in a matter in respect of which parties have made an agreement referred to in Section 44, shall, at the request of one of the parties or any person claiming through or under him, refer the parties to arbitration unless it finds that the said agreement is null and void, inoperative, or incapable of being performed. Now, this language, or any person claiming through or under him, was missing in Section 8. This was the original language in Section 8. Right? That you will only see here there's a reference to party. There it's a party or a person claiming through or under him. Now, this language of Section 45 was incorporated into Section 8 following the amendment. Right? Therefore, today the test under 8 and 45 is exactly the same in relation to whether a third party can be made a party to an arbitration agreement. Prior to the amendment, the Supreme Court in Sukanya Holdings had clearly held that if you are trying to make a non-signatory a party to an arbitration agreement, that is impermissible, and therefore a Section 8 application would be rejected if there was a third party involved in the suit. The Supreme Court went on to hold in Sukanya Holdings that you can't split parties, you can't split causes of action, and the test very clearly was if there is a non-signatory involved, you can't refer them to arbitration. Prior to the amendment, another judgment came up in the context of Section 45, namely the judgment in Chloro Controls. The Supreme Court, a three-judge bench, referred to Sukanya Holdings and said, Sukanya Holdings must be restricted to a domestic arbitration. They recognized the difference in wordings between Section 8 and Section 45 and said 45 is wider because it contains the phrase party claiming through or under, a person claiming through or under a party to an arbitration agreement. This would include within it third parties in certain exceptional scenarios. The test that was set out was broadly a twofold test. One is an intention-based test. Now, while referring to the intention-based test, Supreme Court said, look at the group of companies doctrine. If you have multiple agreements between multiple group entities, right? So you have company A with A1, A2, A3. You have company B with B1, B2, B3. You have multiple agreements. A and B enter into an agreement. A and B2 enter into another agreement. B1 and C2 and B1 and A2 enter into another agreement. You have multiple agreements between two groups. Let's assume that some of the agreements do not contain an arbitration clause. But the main agreement that gives rise to this relationship, let's assume there's a JV agreement, there is a licensing agreement, there is a licensing of trademark agreement, you have various kinds of agreement, you have a services agreement. Let's assume the main agreement is a JV agreement. the main agreement contains an arbitration clause. Then in the case of a mother agreement and a parent agreement and a agreement that comes within the ambit of the parent agreement, if the main agreement has an arbitration clause, you can refer the parties to arbitration. This was the test set out in chlorocontrol. Factually, chlorocontrol is exactly what I just set out. There were two different groups. There was a JV agreement. There were multiple other agreements. JV agreement contained an arbitration clause. Some of the other agreements did not. The Supreme Court still referred disputes between the two groups to arbitration. The chlorocontrols also recognizes a second kind of test, which is not the intention-based test, but the piercing the corporate veil test. Right? Piercing the corporate veil has evolved in outside the ambit of arbitration jurisprudence. There are cases of fraud where you carry out certain acts to defraud creditors. Then in such a scenario, you can pierce the corporate veil and the court can see whether in effect all the entities are a single economic entity. Therefore, the two tests for applicability of or extending an arbitration agreement to non-signatories is first the intention-based test, which largely refers to the group of companies doctrine, and second is the piercing the corporate veil test. Now, this was the position in relation to foreign-seated arbitrations prior to the amendment. Then came the 2015 amendments, following which there are multiple judgments of the Supreme Court where they have applied these tests and ultimately held that the position today is the same, whether it's a foreign-seated arbitration or a domestic arbitration. So you have the case of Duro-Felgura, where the fact that there were 6 different arbitration agreements, the Supreme Court said that we will not apply the chlorocontrol test, though, they held that we will refer it to 6 separate arbitrations. To the contrary, you have Cheran Properties, where the chlorocontrol test was applied to a domestic arbitration. You have Amit Lalchand, you have a number of judgments. So we have set out all the judgments, but the test is what I have just told you now. There are 2 tests. Either you go by the intention-based test or you go by the piercing the corporate veil test. You have a lot of issues emerging in international arbitrations on this because the test is not uniform across the world. So for instance, if you look at Singapore, the test is the same Sukanya Holdings test. So today when you have an arbitration seated in Singapore, there are a lot of issues arise as to whether you will have to apply Indian law for this or Singaporean law. Anyway, all of those are topics by themselves to get into. Right? Therefore, broadly, when you look at controversial aspects under Section 8, you have the aspects of arbitrability and you have the test of third-party signatories. Please note that these are issues that would come up equally before an arbitral tribunal under Section 16. So while I have brought it in under the concept of judicial intervention in the pre-arbitration stage, these would be equally relevant even during the arbitration. The next is going to be Section 9. See, Section 9 I'm going to skim through because a lot of it is pretty straightforward. Now, Section 9 contains a number of reliefs that can be granted. Most of them are self-explanatory. So you can have relief for security under 9(2)(b. You can have interim custody or sale of goods under 9(2)(a). You can have a interim injunction under 9(2)(d). Multiple measures can be granted, but let's just look at the principles that need to be followed. The first principle that evolved through Sundaram Finance versus NEPC and firm Ashok Traders is that there must be you must show a manifest intention to arbitrate if you are to get relief under Section 9. So when you're filing an application under Section 9, you need to ensure that you have that either you've already issued the notice of arbitration or you have a paragraph in your pleading pointing out your intention to initiate arbitration, which needs to be followed up by steps even after you file your Section 9. Section 9 can even be filed prior to the arbitration, but you can't get an interim order and sit on it without initiating arbitration. You must show a manifest intention to arbitrate. Right? That is the first important principle to keep in mind. The second important principle to keep in mind is the preconditions for granting interim measures. The preconditions for granting interim measures would be dependent on the nature of interim measures that you're seeking. Supreme Court has held that you will have to follow the principles set out in the CPC for the grant of the same interim measures. Therefore, if you are seeking an injunction, you will have to show a prima facie case, balance of convenience, and irreparable loss as set out in Order 39. If you are seeking security, you will have to follow the principles set out in Order 38, Rule 5 of the CPC. For this, you can refer to the judgments of the Madras. I will share the PowerPoint because we refer to all the case laws there, but I'm not going to go slide by slide because I will not be able to then complete. Right? So we refer to all the judgments here. You have a lot of judgments. The main ones being the Adhunik Steels. There's one more called Arvind Constructions on how you must follow the principles set out in the CPC. Arvind Constructions is mentioned here. Now, in relation to Order 38, Rule 5 principles being followed when you're asking for security, you have a number of Madras High Court judgments in A1 bis. Right? Now, therefore, two principles to be kept in mind to get relief under 9(1). One, manifest intention to arbitrate. Two, you must make out your case under the principles of the CPC for you to get the relief. The next two provisions have been incorporated by virtue of the amendment 9(2), where before the commencement of the arbitral proceeding, a court passes an order for any interim measure of protection under subsection 1, the arbitral proceeding shall be commenced within a period of 90 days from the date of such order or within such further time as the court may determine. Now, the Law Commission in its 246 report had suggested that if within 90 days you do not commence, then unless the court holds otherwise, the interim order must go. But the legislature has not incorporated it. Now, how do you read section 9(2)? The way in which I look at section 9(2) is to say that the principle set out in Firm Ashok Trader and Sundaram Finance as an NEPC, that is, that once you get an interim order, you must commence your arbitration within a reasonable period. That reasonable period has been statutorily incorporated to be 90 days. That's the way I look at section 9(2). Therefore, section 9(2) merely gives a specific period for the test that already existed under Firm Ashok Traders and Sundaram Finance versus NEPC. The most crucial amendment, though, is section 9(3). Once the arbitral tribunal has been constituted, the court shall not entertain an application under subsection 1 unless the court finds that circumstances exist which may not render the remedy provided under section 17 efficacious. Now, I come to a very, very crucial aspect here before I go into why 9(3) has been incorporated. The amendment to section 9(3) has to be looked at in conjunction with the amendment to section 17. Now, prior to the amendments, there was a vast difference in scope between section 9 and section 17. The Supreme Court in HT Army's case had set out how ineffective section 17 would be, because even if you got an order from the arbitral tribunal under section 17, there was no way of enforcing the order. So, enforceability of the order was a crucial issue as to why you could not get relief from the tribunal. Second was the scope of section 17 itself was vastly different from scope of section 9. Section 17, if you went before the tribunal, you could get much narrower kind of reliefs compared to section 9 prior to the amendment. The third aspect was there was no scope of getting any relief against a third party. So, for instance, if you needed to injunct a sale of the subject matter of arbitration from A to B, and B was not a signatory to the arbitration agreement, such a relief was still possible under section 9 but not under section 17. Second, the last was the time at which you needed to file. Section 17, you would obviously have to file when the tribunal was still in place. You could not do it prior to the tribunal coming into place. all of these resulted in Section 17 becoming a very ineffective remedy. In every case, parties would still go before a civil court and file a Section 9 application. Therefore, what the Law Commission did was amended Section 17, made Section 17 as wide as Section 9. Today, Section 17 is a copy paste of Section 9. We also suggested that an order passed under Section 17 must be enforceable as an order of court. Hence, Section 17 was amended to give an order passed there some teeth. To go with these amendments in Section 17 now became an efficacious remedy. 9(3) was introduced to say, by default, go before the arbitral tribunal, don't come before courts. The idea was to reduce judicial intervention and keep everything before the arbitral tribunal. Now, in most situations, you will have an efficacious remedy before the tribunal once the tribunal is constituted. Therefore, the scope of filing a Section 9 application now is drastically reduced to cases where the tribunal has not yet been constituted, or some exceptional cases like this Pradeep KN, which is put down here, where police protection was required for enforcing an order. The Kerala High Court took the view that being a creature of contract, an arbitral tribunal cannot direct a police authority to take some action. I have my own differences on this, but this is the view that the Kerala High Court has taken. Madras High Court has followed it in an interim order. There is no final determination by the Madras High Court. So these are situations where you would rather be safe and file under Section 9 and point out that, well, the remedy under 17 may not be efficacious. What if the police does not follow the order passed by the arbitral tribunal? These are situations where 9 would still be maintainable. Usually what happens, you file a Section 9. During the pendency of the 9, very often the tribunal gets constituted. Thereafter, what courts have held is that the norm should be to refer everything to the tribunal under Section 17. So courts tend to extend interim orders by, say, 2 weeks or 3 weeks and say, now you proceed before the tribunal under 17 for any further remedies. Right? Therefore, today, following the amendment, the scope of Section 9 has become much narrower and most remedies have to be before the tribunal. This is again to enforce that policy consideration I mentioned in the beginning. That is, since it's an alternative dispute resolution, since parties have chosen an arbitrator to decide the issue, ideally even the interim relief should be decided by the arbitrator and not by the court. Then I come to another very crucial aspect of pre-arbitration interference, namely under Section 11. Right now, under Section 11, where there's a procedure prescribed for parties to appoint an arbitrator, that procedure has not been followed. The parties have a right to approach. Earlier, it was the Chief Justice. Post the 2015 amendment, it was the court for appointment of an arbitrator. Now, so therefore, if there's a timeline specified, if I send a notice of arbitration, if it's a sole arbitrator, I send a notice, the other side does not reply within 30 days, then I get to go and move an application under Section 11, where it's a 3-member tribunal. I appoint, the other side appoints. The 2 arbitrators cannot agree. Then again, you get to go under Section 11 after a period of 30 days. Or if the other side does not appoint within 30 days, then you get to go under Section 11. So these are all the relatively non-controversial aspects. What is controversial is what can a court get into under Section 11. Right? The nature of the power under Section 11 has been the subject matter of discussion for many years. It started with the Konkan railway cases, where originally it was held The first Konkan Railway case, it was held that it's a judicial power. Then it was held that it's an administrative power. Then ultimately it was considered the problem with it being an administrative power was the Chief Justice would appoint somebody and that would be subject to a writ petition. Then everything came to be considered in SBP versus Patel Engineering, where the Supreme Court held that Section 11 was a judicial power, even though it was being exercised by the Chief Justice and not a court at that point. The only remedy against a Section 11 order was to file an SLP under Article 136 of the Constitution. The Supreme Court in Patel Engineering also set out very broadly what could be gone into under Section 11. This test set out in Patel Engineering was very neatly categorized by the Honorable Supreme Court in National Insurance versus Bogra Polyfab. The Supreme Court set out various categories. They set out a category which the court has to go into, namely issues of jurisdiction and issue of whether there exists an arbitration agreement. Category 2 was issues that the court, the Chief Justice, could choose to go into. Issues like whether the claim was a dead claim, or that is where it was hopelessly barred by limitation. Third category was issues the Chief Justice could not go into, issues of merits. Right? This categorization existed. Then came the 2015 amendments, which introduced 11.6a. 11.6a said that the only issue that could be gone into was existence of an arbitration agreement. Now, existence of an arbitration, therefore, when you look at it to that extent in relation to the scope of judicial intervention under Section 11, the judgment in Bogra Polyfab stood legislatively overruled. But following this, following the amendments, there are conflicting decisions of the Honorable Supreme Court. The judgment in Dura Felgura's case narrowly construes 11.6a to say that no other issue other than existence of arbitration agreement can be gone into. Duro Felguro was a division bench. Please keep the bench strength in mind because it's very important when I come to the controversy. Thereafter, there were other judgments of the Supreme Court. One was Oriental Insurance versus Narberam Power, and then a 3-judge bench in United India Insurance versus Hyundai Engineering. Right? Please note, United India versus Hyundai was a 3-judge bench, where the Supreme Court went into the issue of an accepted matter. Right? So the clause, the arbitration clause had some exceptions. And the argument was that those exceptions, that the case fell within the ambit of those exceptions. The Supreme Court under Section 11 went into it. They applied principles of insurance law to say that an insurance contract must be strictly construed. Therefore, an arbitration agreement contained in an insurance contract must be strictly construed. Right? After holding that, so therefore, I refer to these broadly as the insurance cases. The insurance cases actually went into an issue of accepted matter. Please keep in mind one important fact. Even prior to the amendment, matters pertaining to accepted matters and arbitrability could not be gone into under Section 11 based on the decision of the Supreme Court in Arsenavia's case versus Lafarge. I'll show you that judgment here. Aras Mehta versus Lafarge. This case, which I'm highlighting, Supreme Court had arbitrability cannot be gone into. Specifically, that was a case of accepted matter. So prior to the amendment, the scope was it could not be gone into. The amendment further restricted the scope. Yet, in this judgment, in Oriental Insurance with Narberam Power and United India versus Hyundai Engineering, the Supreme Court went into it and incorporated the accepted matters test into Section 11. Please keep in mind that a 2-judge bench of the Supreme Court in this judgment, United India Insurance versus Anti-Cards, followed the three-judge bench in United India Insurance versus Hyundai Engineering and held that the issue of accepted matters can be gone into under Section 11 even post the amendments. Right? Very, very crucial. The reason this is crucial is another three-judge bench of the Supreme Court in Mayawati trading considered the issue. The Supreme Court in Mayawati trading said that the division bench in Duro Felgura was correct and expressly overruled United India Insurance versus Anti-Cart. Expressly overruled it. But what is important to keep in mind is that Anti-Carts, United India Insurance versus Anti-Carts, follows a three-judge bench in United India Insurance versus Hyundai. The Supreme Court in Mayawati trading does not consider Hyundai Engineering at all. Because in Mayawati trading, they could not have overruled Hyundai Engineering. Both were the same bench strength. Both were three judges. The matter would have had to be referred to a larger bench. So what they do in Mayawati is overrule a division bench which squarely follows the three-judge bench and completely miss out the three-judge bench in Hyundai Engineering. Therefore, today there is complete confusion on what is the position under Section 11 because you have three-judge benches of the Supreme Court that are conflicting. Mayawati, which says you cannot get into accepted matters, and expressly overrules the division bench which gets into accepted matters. And Hyundai Engineering, where they expressly say you can get into accepted matters. Therefore, in relation to arbitrability, I think the matter will have to be gone into by a five-judge bench. My own view is that Mayawati is the correct conclusion, but Mayawati could not have got there because they would have had to refer it to a larger bench owing to the judgment in Hyundai Engineering. Very interestingly, Mayawati is AIR 2019 Supreme Court 4284. If you look at the SEC report, the very next judgment is by the same bench in Rashid Raza's case that I earlier referred to on arbitrability of fraud. Right? Same bench, adjacent pages in the SEC volume. Mayawati trading, the same bench holds you can't get into arbitrability, you can't get into accepted matters, only existence of arbitration agreement can be gone into. The very next judgment in Rashid Raza, same three judges, I think the author is the same, the other two judges are different. They hold that they go into the issue of arbitrability of fraud and say that fraud is not, and set out the test for that, all under in a Section 11, SLP arising from a Section 11. So today there is the position is there is a conflict. The matter will have to be considered by a five-judge bench. In my view, ultimately the import of 11.6a is that the test under Section 11 must be as narrow as possible, and all issues of arbitrability, accepted matters must be before the arbitral tribunal under Section 16. Right? But all of this requires reconsideration by a larger bench. In the meantime, the 2019 amendment does away with this entire scheme for Section 11 and says that if there is an arbitral institution that is graded by the Arbitration Council of India that is still to be set up, then you can go directly before the institution and get tribunals constituted by the registrars of the institutions. Right? This seems to be a very novel idea. And once this happens, Section 11 virtually goes out of the window insofar as judicial interference is concerned. But we still have to wait and see how this works because this provision has not been notified yet. Arbitration Council of India has not been set up yet. Therefore, we are still a few years away. Until then, we will still have to get into the debate as to what is the scope of interference under Section 11. So first, an Arbitration Council will have to be set up. Then they will have to set up, they will have to grade institutions. And once institutions are graded, the 2019 amendments would be notified. I personally also feel that this is a system that may work in a place like Singapore or Hong Kong from which they borrowed it. the Justice Sri Krishna Committee report refers to Singapore and Hong Kong, may not work in India because you require arbitral institutions of absolute integrity across the country. And till such time you have a few states with good arbitral institutions, but the majority of the states in India still do not have good arbitral institutions. Okay, I've briefly set out, you can look into the PowerPoint on the March of Law in relation to Section 11. All the judgments are set out here. Right. Now, when we look at judicial intervention during the proceedings, primarily are looking at Section 27. Okay, I'm just going to run through some of these so I can get to Section 34 quickly. Now, so if if a party requires court assistance in taking evidence, if the arbitrator issues summons to a third party who would be a relevant witness, and the third party does not come, then in such a scenario, if the evidence is of such importance, parties with the permission of the tribunal can then go and approach court under Section 27. I can give you one example. For instance, we had one arbitration where a particular letter which was very critical was sent by courier. Right? The parties did not, so the other side denied the fact that they had received this courier. We did not have any originals. We had subsequently reached out to the courier authorities and they had given a scanned copy of their records to show it was delivered, along with proof of who had signed. Now, this entire courier, everything in the case turned on this particular issue. So in that case, we had approached, with the permission of the tribunal, we had approached the court under 27 and got a direction that the courier authorities, Blue Dart in that case, must come and testify on the delivery of the courier itself. Because there was some evidence to suggest it had been delivered, but we didn't have perfect evidence for it. So that's one example, right? Now, there's also a power of contempt that is available to the arbitral tribunal under 27(5). Right? Now, let me go on to judicial intervention post-arbitration. Now, before I go into this, Section 14, we have brought in under pre-arbitration because very often it gets intermingled along with Section 11. Right? So once there is a tribunal that is constituted, now the arbitrator has to give certain disclosures. Right? There are two schedules, Schedule 5 and Schedule 7. These are broadly incorporated from the International Bar Association guidelines on conflict of interest. I'll tell you the history behind this. Originally, Supreme Court in Indian Oil versus Raja Transport had held that where a PSU appoints its own employee as an arbitrator, then there is no conflict of interest and such appointment would be valid. This stood legislatively overruled by virtue of Schedule 5 and Schedule 7, which brought in certain criteria of relationship between the arbitrator and the parties, between the arbitrator and the counsel. So if you fall within Schedule 7, there is a complete bar from acting as an arbitrator unless the parties consent after the dispute has arisen between the parties for such an arbitrator to continue. If the relationship falls within Schedule 5, then a disclosure has to be made. It gives reasonable doubts in relation to the impartiality of the arbitrator, but there is no requirement for the arbitrator to step down. If in case of any allegations of bias, if there is a Schedule 5 contravention under Section 13, application will have to be taken on before the tribunal. But if there is a contravention of Schedule 7, right, and the arbitrator continues, then parties can file an application under Section 14 pursuant to the judgment of the Supreme Court in HRD's case to say that the arbitrator is barred from acting and therefore is de jure. It is impossible for the arbitrator to perform his functions. they can seek termination of the mandate of the arbitrator under Section 14 by approaching court. Now, this test has been widened a little bit because the Supreme Court in subsequent judgments has held that if an arbitrator is unilaterally appointed by a party, then also the arbitrator would be hit by Schedule 7. For this, you need to look into the judgment of the Supreme Court in Perkins case. The Supreme Court has also held that if one party unilaterally suggests a panel of 5, like the railways contract says that they will suggest a panel of 4, from which the other party has to select one, then this principle will not be attracted and the appointment is perfectly valid. The only issue comes with a unilateral appointment. A lot of the contracts under that one enters into with NBFCs contains a provision for unilateral appointment. In all such cases where an arbitrator is unilaterally appointed, the same can be challenged under under Section 14 based on the judgment of the Supreme Court in Perkins case. Right? Now therefore I've now dealt with interference pre and during the arbitration. Now let me come to post-arbitration judicial interference. Right? Now, there are two aspects. One is the scope of Section 34, and the second is the whole concept of automatic stay. Okay? Now, let me deal with the scope of Section 34 first. Now, Section 34 consists of number of grounds or pigeonholes, so Supreme Court calls it. So the various pigeonholes are listed here. Most of them are related to either procedural aspects or natural justice aspects or existence of an arbitration agreement. The controversial one is 8 and 9. Okay. So if a party was under some incapacity, or the arbitration agreement is not valid, or parties are not given proper notice of the appointment of the arbitrator or of the arbitral proceedings and hence were unable to present their case, or if it was a dispute not falling within the terms of submission to arbitration. All of these are grounds, right? If the composition of the tribunal was not in accordance with the agreement between the parties, or if it is not an arbitrable dispute, all of these are grounds available, relatively non-controversial. Again, you will see here the arbitrability test. Again, you will see the test on existence of an arbitration agreement. All of these that we have earlier dealt with. What has been controversial is 8 and now 9. Award is in conflict with public policy of India. Now, what is public policy of India? Supreme Court, prior to the 1996 Act, the same wording was there in the Foreign Awards Act 1961. In the context of a foreign award, the Supreme Court held that public policy would include fundamental policy of Indian law, interest of India, justice or morality. Supreme Court went on without defining each of these terms in great detail to say, contravention of a statute like FERA that would have economic consequences on the country, that is a statute made for the economic benefit of a country, would fall within the ambit of fundamental policy of Indian law. The test was a pretty narrow test in Renu Sagar. Then came the judgment in ONGC versus Saw Pipes under Section 34 relating to a domestic award, where the Supreme Court went on to say that in addition to the Renu Sagar test, you must have a fourth criteria, namely patent illegality. If an award was patently illegal, then it would be a contravention of public policy. Now, this virtually threw open the floodgates, and every award would be challenged on the ground that it was patently illegal. The test in ONGC versus Saw Pipes was a pretty wide test. They said that any award that shocks the conscience of the court would be patently illegal. There was no specific test set out. though they said that a contravention of the contract, a contravention of the Arbitration Act would all result in patent illegality. Now, when you see the march of law, there were a number of judgments post SAW pipes that tried to narrow down SAW pipes. There was a criticism of SAW pipes that was noted even in McDermott's case, where they ultimately said, and following a number of judgments, patent illegality came to be set out as being 1, a contravention of the contract, 2, a contravention of law, 3, contravention of requirements under the Arbitration Act itself, like failure to give reasons. Right? Now, while this test came to be standardized, another judgment came about in ONGC versus Western Gecko that further threw open the floodgates. In this judgment, in ONGC versus Western Gecko, the term fundamental policy of Indian law came to be defined for the first time. The Supreme Court, amongst other criteria, set out that a contravention of the Wednesbury principles of reasonableness would result in a violation of fundamental policy of Indian law. Now, Wednesbury principles of reasonableness is exceedingly wide. What happened? So, therefore, this would include an award based on irrelevant considerations or irrelevant evidence. 2, an award that fails to consider material considerations or material evidence. 3, an award based on no evidence at all. All of these would be susceptible to challenge based on the fundamental policy of Indian law test following the judgment in ONGC versus Western Gecko. The test was minimally narrowed in Associate Builders. Associate Builders, the Supreme Court could not do much because Western Gecko was a 3-judge bench, Associated Builders was a division bench. They set out the various categories again in Associated Builders. Now, these judgments came out at about the same time as the Law Commission report. So, Law Commission then came up with a modified report to further narrow down the test under Section 34. Now, following the amendment, now what did the amendments essentially do? The amendments narrowed down the test for foreign seated arbitral awards and international commercial arbitration awards drastically. Right? Fundamental policy of Indian law remained, but in a much narrowed down form. Patent illegality was a ground available only for a challenge to a domestic arbitration award. Even the patent illegality test was narrowed down to say that a test review on merits is not permissible. Right? Following these amendments, there have been a number of judgments on the point. Everything is set out in the PPT, but what I will do is show you a chart that summarizes what the test is today. Please give me 1 minute. I'm just opening the chart for this. Yes. So we have prepared like a color-coded presentation to show you what is included, what was the test prior, what is no longer available. Now, when you look at this, right, what is in blue? So I'm in this, we're taking each head and looking at how it has evolved. Now, what is in blue remains unchanged. So this sets out the scope of fundamental policy of Indian law prior to the amendment. At that point, it included the following, right? Disregarding orders of superior courts, Wednesbury principles of reasonableness, principles of natural justice, following a judicial approach. This was the widest possible test. The authority acted in an arbitrary, whimsical, and capricious manner, unfair, unreasonable, and not objective manner, non-application. Very, very wide test, judicial approach. And the fifth was contravention of statute linked to national economic interest. This is the same Renu Sagar test. Right? Therefore, there were 5 broad heads. Now, following the amendment, what has happened is what is in red has been deleted altogether, as interpreted by the Supreme Court in Sanyong and Vijay Karya's cases. So, judicial approach is out. This wide test is no longer available. what is in yellow, Wednesbury principles of reasonableness, has been shifted from one bucket to another. Earlier, it was under the fundamental policy of Indian law bucket. Now it has moved from fundamental policy of Indian law to patent illegality. Please note that patent illegality is now available only for challenging a domestic award. If the challenge is to an international commercial arbitration award that is seated in India, or for refusing enforcement of a foreign seated arbitration award, patent illegality is no longer available as a ground for challenge. Therefore, this Wednesbury principle of reasonableness that includes ignoring vital evidence, finding based on no evidence, and consideration of irrelevant material has shifted boxes from fundamental policy of Indian law to patent illegality, which means that today when you challenge an international commercial arbitration award in India or you oppose enforcement of a foreign seated arbitration award, your test is a far more restricted test to include only this. Disregarding orders of a superior court, contravention of principles of natural justice, and contravention of statute linked with national economic interest. This is the test, right? 3-step test is what is available, but let me put a caveat. Now, this contravention of statute linked with national economic interest has further been complicated. I gave you the background as to how it was included, contravention of statute linked with national economic interest. It was incorporated by virtue of Renu Sagar, where the Supreme Court had said that contravention of FERA would come within the ambit of the test. The issue that arose in the judgment of Vijay Karya's case was whether a contravention of FEMA would also be against fundamental policy of Indian law, because FEMA is also a statute linked with national economic interest. What the Supreme Court held was that FEMA might be linked to national economic interest, but when you look at the scheme of FEMA, FEMA is more for managing foreign exchange, and even if there's a contravention, the RBI can let off a contravening party with a warning. That was not the case under FERA, where there were stringent punishments. Therefore, what the Supreme Court held was that it's not enough if the statute is linked with national economic interest. It must also be contravention, I'm quoting from the Supreme Court judgment, of some legal principle or legislation which is so basic to Indian law that it is not susceptible of being compromised. Right? You can imagine how vague the test is today and how much litigation is going to arise because of this. So today, even if it is linked to national economic interest, there has to be contravention of some legal principle or legislation which is so basic to Indian law that it is not susceptible of being compromised. So this is the test under fundamental policy of Indian law. Now, scope of patent illegality prior to the amendment was contravention of terms of the contract, contravention of substantive law, and contravention of section 31(3) of the Act, that is, where no reasons have been given for passing the award. Now, one additional bucket has been added, namely Wednesbury principles of reasonableness has been transported from fundamental policy of Indian law to patent illegality and brought in under the head of perversity. Therefore, today, when you look at a summary, the post-amendment, the key changes are Wednesbury principle has moved, and therefore has moved buckets and is only available for a domestic award, not for an international commercial arbitration award or a foreign seated arbitration award. You have contravention of substantive law. This is important. Now, contravention of substantive law was available as a ground prior to the 2015 amendment. So it was enough to say that there's a contravention of section 16 of the Specific Relief Act, therefore the award has to be set aside. Now that has been modified in Sanyong's case to say contravention of statutes linked to public policy or public interest. right? Therefore, today it's not enough to say that Section 16 of the Specific Relief Act has to be has been violated. The tribunal has ignored it, and therefore the award must be set aside. I must also be able to show that that statutory provision that has been contravened is linked to public policy or public interest. Now, insofar as contravention of terms of the contract, it is imperative to show that it is not just a wrong interpretation, but this is an interpretation that no reasonable or fair-minded person could have arrived at. In other words, if it's a plausible view, the view of the arbitrator would stand. If the view was so impossible and so absurd, then courts can set it aside. Again, where do you draw the line? There is ambiguity. As you see, the test today has become more and more complicated, and a lot of the onus is now on the arbitration process because courts have been, by and large, adopting a hands-off approach when it comes to arbitral awards. One last aspect that I need to deal with in relation to post-award challenges is to deal with Section 36. Now, prior to the amendment, you had the concept of automatic stay by virtue of the judgment of the Supreme Court in National Aluminium versus Prestige. What the Supreme Court had said was that mere filing of an award would result in the award becoming inexecutable pending the challenge, which resulted in what is popularly known as the automatic stay. Now, that was done away with by the 2015 amendments, which specifically said that there shall be no automatic stay and you need to file an application for stay. While granting a stay, it is open to the court to put the party on terms based on following the principles in Order 41 of the CPC. Now, there was a controversy as to whether this amendment would apply prospectively or retrospectively. There was confusion. The Supreme Court in BCCI's case, this is Kochi Tuskers, while holding that Section 36 would certainly be retrospective, there was ambiguity about the rest of the statute. This stood legislatively overruled by virtue of Section 87 that was introduced by virtue of the 2019 amendments. But Section 87 has been struck down by the Supreme Court in Hindustan Construction versus Union of India as being manifestly arbitrary. Again, this is a topic by itself. This prospectivity, retrospectivity, the topic by itself, and I'm not going to get into it in great detail. Right? Before I conclude, and I want to briefly deal with just one more aspect, namely, well, okay, conditions in relation to enforcement of a foreign award are identical. So, insofar as the foreign award is concerned, the foreign award will have to be presented under Section 47. Thereafter, the other side has to file objections under Section 48. Section 48 and Section 34 are identical, except that the ground for patent illegality is not available under Section 48. Therefore, the test under Section 48 will not include the wide patent illegality test. It will be a narrow test. Otherwise, the law is the same. So, SsangYong would equally apply even to Section 48. There are other judgments like Vijay Karya, right? These are in relation to foreign seated arbitrations. But one more crucial controversy that's been there in relation to, now I will in relation to foreign seated arbitrations is the Bhatia-Balco issue, as it's popularly known as. Applicability of Part 1 to foreign seated arbitration agreements, foreign seated arbitrations. Now, what had happened was there was a discrepancy in while we had incorporated Section 2.2 from the UNCITRAL model law. The Indian legislature had missed out some very important phrases. The Section 2.2, the equivalent of Section 2.2 in the UNCITRAL model law was Article 2.1e, which said that this part shall apply where the seat of arbitration is in the member state, except for certain provisions, including 9, 27, 37, etc. 9 was very important because let's look at a scenario where there's an arbitration between two parties where the arbitration is seated in London. But one of the most important properties that is the subject matter of arbitration is in India. Right? Usually the international principle is only the courts of the seat would have jurisdiction. If you follow that principle, you can file an application for interim relief only before the courts of the seat, which would be London. Before you get an order from London and you come to India, that property would have been disposed of. So what the Supreme Court, so ideally this language in the ancestral model law, if it had been included, there would have been no controversy because the Section 9 was never contemplated to be seat dependent. Unfortunately, the legislature, while drafting the 1996 Act, left out this exception. Therefore, either the whole of Part 1 had to be applicable to a foreign seated arbitration or would not be applicable, whichever way the court held. In Bhatia International, which is the pre-Balco position as we've called it here, the Supreme Court said that in order to do justice, we will have to hold that Section 9 is applicable. The facts of the case required it, but the Supreme Court went on to set out some principles to say that merely because the seat of the arbitration is outside, it does not mean that Part 1 of the Arbitration Act is excluded. You have to see whether there's an express or implied exclusion of Part 1. If there was an express or implied exclusion, then Part 1 would be excluded. Otherwise, Part 1 would not be excluded. On the facts of the case, even though the seat of arbitration in that case was Paris, the courts held that Section 9 would be applicable and granted interim relief. Now, Section 9 itself is not the problem. The problem comes with the observation that Part 1 itself would apply to foreign seated arbitrations unless expressly or impliedly excluded. Now, Part 1 includes other provisions like Section 34. Therefore, if Part 1 would apply to a foreign seated arbitration, even though the seat may be foreign, Section 34 would also apply and you could challenge a foreign seated arbitration award in India. There were a number of other judgments starting from Venture Global versus Satyam. You had Dosco versus Doosan, you had about 20 judgments, you had about 6 or 7 Supreme Court and maybe around 20 High Court judgments interpreting what do you mean by an implied exclusion, what do you mean by an express exclusion. Finally, in Balco, a larger bench of the Supreme Court overruled Bhatia and held that if the seat is abroad, then Part 1 will not apply. Right? The problem with Balco was twofold. When you say Part 1 will not apply, Section 9 also would not apply. Therefore, in the example that I gave you where the arbitration is in London but the property is in India, you would not have any efficacious remedy so far as the property is concerned. Second problem with Balco was it was made prospectively applicable to arbitration agreements entered into post the judgment in Balco. Right? Therefore, you had a different regime pre-2012, September 2012, different regime post-September 2012, which resulted in some confusion. You also had the problem with Section 9. All of this required a legislative amendment that was brought in by virtue of the 2015 amendments, which brought in the ancestral model law provision. Right? So now, following this, Section 2.2 will not apply, based on Section Part 1, will not apply to a foreign seated arbitration except for Section 9, Section 27 and Section 37. Insofar as these provisions also, it is open to parties to opt out of it. Therefore, I can have in my arbitration agreement that Part 1 is entirely excluded, including Section 9. But if in the absence of an exclusion of Section 9, 27 and 37 1A, Part 1 would stand excluded if the seat of arbitration is outside India. Right? You also have a number of judgments on seat versus venue. I think I'm running short of time. I don't think I can deal with all of these judgments. I've set them out. In essence, the test today is the judgments, there's some confusion caused because of Hardy exploration. Said that venue would not mean seat. And then there were judgments like BGS, which says that venue plus something else would amount to seat. Now the latest judgment says that venue in the absence of anything to the contrary would amount to a seat. I'm not going to go into this in detail because you have a number of other judgments on this point which have to be dealt with carefully. I don't think I have the time for that. But yeah, I broadly tried to cover the various aspects of judicial intervention in arbitrations, both domestic and foreign. I'm happy to take any questions.
Yes, sir. Thank you so much, sir, for that valuable insight on the subject and for sharing with us your knowledge and experience on the topic. I'm sure we all have gained a little more bit of knowledge and awareness on the subject and hope to pass it on and put it to practical use in our legal practice. If it is possible, it will be great if you could share the PPT with us, sir. I'm sure many participants would also like that.
Yes, I'll send it, and thank you. It's been a pleasure, and would again like to thank Justice Padmanabhan and Dr. Paul for inviting me to be before you all today.
Yes, sir. And I'm sure some participants would have queries for you, and with your permission, we can open the floor for a few questions as a part of a Q&A session.
Sure, certainly.
Yes. I request all the participants to type in your questions in the chat window, and you can also unmute and ask the question after we request you to. Before we get a question from our participants, I would like to ask something, sir. So which country do you feel has good arbitration laws and which does not have lots of negative judicial impact in arbitration?
No, when you look at it, every country has evolved, and we are in the evolution process. So when you look at countries today, popular seats like London and Singapore, they have also had their fair share of judicial intervention, and I don't think this is a case where courts can just adopt a hands-off approach till we mature as an arbitration jurisdiction. When you look at it, you may have experienced legal minds as arbitrators in some cases, but you still have a lot of other cases, smaller stake matters, where sometimes the parties cannot really afford to go for experienced legal minds. You may have some cases of which require that hand-holding till we get to a stage where we become a very experienced and mature arbitration hub. Some amount of hand-holding is required. So we are now going through the process, and I would think now in the next 5-6 years, we're going to see a lot of significant growth. We have seen significant improvements in the system post 2015 itself, and parties are now becoming very responsible when it comes to their appointments of arbitrators, because they know that with courts taking a hands-off approach at the stage of challenge, it's imperative that they get their tribunal right. So I think a lot more thought is going in at the stage of appointments itself, and I'm quite positive. I see some light at the end of the tunnel, though the light is still some way away.
Yes, sir. Thank you. And we have Sai Bhaskar Parthasarathy with a question. If you cannot go into merits of the case, how would court judge on substantial law matters?
Yeah, so now now merits would mean getting into the factual issues and reappreciating evidence. Now on issues of law, there is a narrow test that has now been set out. Now, it's not a contravention of a law that is linked to public policy or public interest, is still within permissible grounds for a review. And the reason this test has been further narrowed from saying any any contravention of any law has been narrowed down to say contravention of law linked to public interest is because of the amendments, which says that where there's an explanation that's been added saying a mere erroneous application of law is not a ground to set aside an award. Therefore, this narrow test is still within the permissible limits. When you refer to merits, what is primarily being referred to is reappreciation of evidence. That is not permissible. So a court cannot say, well, document C3 read with questions 5 and 8 of CW1's cross-examination would mean that the conclusion of the arbitrator is wrong. That cannot be gone into. That is an issue of merits. That can't be gone into.
Thank you, sir, for explaining it in such a concise manner. Bhaskar sir, if you would like to unmute and discuss on it, you could.
Thank you. I got the idea. Thank you, sir.
Yes, sir. We have another question from Aluru Krishna. What is the scope of party autonomy in case of Perkins judgment, as party autonomy is primary facet of ADR? Krishna sir, unmute and ask the question as well. Yes, sir.
Yes. So yeah. Now this is an interesting question, because again there is a conflict between three judgments. Okay. First judgment along this was West Alpine, where the Supreme Court division bench says that where there's a unilateral panel that is suggested, the panel has to be a broad-based panel with number of names of various categories, and they look at, I think, 20, or they don't mention a number, but in that case they look at a panel of 20 or 30 arbitrators. This was prior to the entire dispute on the conflicting judgment starting off. Thereafter, there was a three-judge bench of the Supreme Court which went on to say, the clause in that contract was that the arbitrator should be either the managing director of the company or a person appointed by the managing director. The managing director in that case appointed a retired Delhi High Court judge. This was challenged, saying that where the a managing director himself is not capable of acting as an arbitrator, and he is hit by the 7th schedule, how can he appoint a arbitrator unilaterally? And that the 7th schedule test must be extended to applying to a case of appointing authority as well, right? Following this came the judgment of Perkins. They extended this view of the three-judge bench to say that any kind of unilateral appointment by the party would also be hit by the same principle, because the party is not capable of acting as an arbitrator because they would be hit by the 7th schedule. So whether it's a managing director of a party or a party, the position should be the same. Therefore, they extended this principle to say that any kind of unilateral appointment is not valid. The fourth judgment on the point was the judgment in that railways case. Central, I forget the name, arose out of a railways contract, and CORE, it's called CORE, the Central Organization of Railways. Okay, in that judgment, the railways contract provides for unilateral suggestion of a panel by the railways, and from that panel, the party must choose. Now, Supreme Court drew a distinction in this case after considering Perkins to say that pure party autonomy is not affected. You are still choosing the person yourself, right? But in this case, it was a panel of 4 suggested by the railways that is held to be valid. This again was a three-judge bench, CORE. But if you go back to the first judgment in West Alpine, the Supreme Court says, a division bench of the Supreme Court says it must be a broad-based panel. 4 would not be a broad-based panel. So there is still some contradiction. But the position that emerges today is that if it is a unilateral appointment of an arbitrator by a party, it is hit by Perkins. If it is not a unilateral appointment of an arbitrator by a party, but a party suggests a few names and the other party chooses from those names, that is still valid. But those names that are suggested must not fall foul of 7th schedule. That's the principle that emerges today.
Yes, sir. Thank you so much. And we also have a question posted by a profile called Chess Talkies. Can an arbitration be resolved more quickly? Say something like fast track, if any manner. If yes, how?
Well, there is a provision for fast track arbitration under 29 capital B. You also have a lot of institutional rules, such as like the SIAC institutional rules have an expedited procedure where within 6 months it has to be resolved. But all of these are good in theory because when you look at a complicated, simple matters, it may be possible. But when you look at a complicated matter, even the international mean is about 18 months or so. So, and we are following the advent of 29A. I think most of our tribunals have been sticking to this timeline. Well, at maximum, there have been one extension or so. So I think within 24 months, most disputes are being resolved. Of course, there are some that are very, very complicated that may require an extended trial. But one way of expediting it is to bring in some of these technologies that are used in international arbitrations to India, like instant transcription. So in India, you have cross-examination over multiple days, where you ask questions, somebody types it, then there's an answer that's dictated, the answer is typed. So this process, you're able to do 100 questions a day. In an international arbitration with live transcription, you do 600 questions a day. Right. Today, I know that live transcription softwares are still being developed in India. International softwares are a little expensive. They cost 3 lakhs a day. But there are a few attempts being made to develop this locally in India. If that succeeds and we are able to have instant transcription, then it won't be you dictating a question and a steno taking down the answer. It will be a conversation between the cross-examining counsel and the witness, and you will be able to complete 500 to 600 questions a day. That I think would greatly expedite the speed of the trial process. Because when you look at it, if a trial spreads, so if you have to ask about 1,000 questions at the end of it between both parties, that is split over 10 days. And so therefore you split it over maybe three days each over 3 tranches, that itself goes over 4 to 5 months. Instead, if you are going to have 1,000 questions completed in 3 days or 2 days, it will just require one sitting of the tribunal to complete the trial. So I think that's one way of expediting things.
Yes, and it answers the question from Varun Kumar also. He also wanted to know your views on practical implications of Section 29A. So.
Now, there's one issue though on 29A now. Post the 2019 amendments, there is 6 months for completion of pleadings, and thereafter the timeline starts. What about scenarios where what is the consequence of not completing within that period? Like, we are going to see that now, because thanks to this COVID lockdown, a lot of parties have not been able to, since offices are not open, a lot of parties have delayed in submission of pleadings. So now, can an arbitrator say that beyond 6 months I will not take your pleadings? Now, will that then be subject to a challenge thereafter in court? Can somebody cite these times to say there were difficulties and therefore the time period is extended? Though there is a Supreme Court order that says that all time periods are extended in the Arbitration Act. So I think that will come to the rescue. But okay, let's even assume outside the COVID scenario. Can you, what about a party that submits its pleadings after 6 months? What are the consequences? What about an amendment to pleadings carried out after 6 months? All of these are ambiguities that have arisen because of the wording of the 2019 amendments to 29A, which was frankly unnecessary, because I think the original 29A, though worded crudely, was working quite well at the practical level.
Yes, sir. Yes, sure. Thank you. And we also have a question from Kaushik, Mr. Kaushik TNC. Can you please elucidate on dealing fraud in arbitration? I'm sure you covered most of it in your presentation.
Yeah, I dealt with the judgments during my presentation on arbitrability of fraud, starting from Radha Krishnan till latest in Rashid Raza. Now, I think I would only suggest that you read 2 paragraphs of Rashid Raza, paragraph 3 and paragraph 4. It's a 5-paragraph judgment. That is the law today. Now, paragraph 3 cites paragraph 26 of Ayasami. Paragraph 4 sets out the Supreme Court summary of Ayaswamy. Now, if you have to argue for a narrow test, you will argue based on paragraph 4 being the law of the land. If you have to argue for a wider test, you will say that paragraph 4 is not intended to curtail paragraph 3 because paragraph 3 cites paragraph 26 of Ayaswamy with approval. And therefore, you will argue that paragraph 26 of Ayaswamy is the law. This is the ambiguity. If you just read these 2 paragraphs, it will become clear.
Yes, sir. Thank you so much on that. Oh. Any other questions? Paul, sir, do you have some question for?
Yeah, that's quite informative. Yeah, yes.
Yes. Sir.
Yes, Bhargavi, just ask for any more question, otherwise we can wind up.
Yes, sir. Participants, if you have any more questions, just type it in or you can unmute and ask it. Otherwise, we'll end up the session. Anirudh sir, is it difficult to, not difficult, how do you manage litigation and arbitration?
What I do is I try and fix up certain number of days of arbitration in a week. So I try and see if it can be combined. Ideally, if it can be combined with a weekend plus a Thursday, Friday or something like that, so 4 days, or even if it is 2 days a week or something, because today we have moved past the evening arbitration era. So we still do some evening arbitration, but for full day arbitrations, I try and ensure I'm in court 3 days a week at least. And then you block out time slots for preparation for arbitration. You block off, you prepare like a schedule when you know that there's going to be cross on a particular day. You block off time periods before that for preparation, because arbitrations require a lot more preparation, because it's all sort of in 4 days continuously you're going to be doing cross examination. You need to know the facts. Plus, I have an excellent team that is sort of they know exactly what is required, and 90-95% of what they do is almost final. So
thank you so much, sir. So I think we don't have any more questions, so that brings to the close of the session. I'd like to thank everyone on participating in the webinar. Firstly, I would like to thank our speaker, Mr. Anirudh Krishnan, for his time and for sharing his knowledge and experience on the subject. And I also take this opportunity to express my gratitude for our honorary chairman, Justice C. Padmanabhan, for his continual guidance and support. I thank our president, Dr. Paul Chandrakumar, for giving us the opportunity and guidance to conduct this webinars. I also thank Sai and Sai, our sponsor, for all their support and coordination. Finally, I would also like to thank our participants for joining us on this penultimate episode of the webinar series, and looking forward to meeting you on the 4th and the final part of the webinar series on 20th of June. Thank you all and have a pleasant day.
thank you very much.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you, Mr. Krishnan. It's been wonderful.
Thank you so much, sir. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Krishnan. Thank you.